Are you sick of scrolling through Netflix and Hulu searching for movies that are high quality and family friendly? Christian Cinema has thousands of movies available on demand that you can watch anytime, anywhere. When you sign up for a giving membership, a premium offering from Christian Cinema, you can watch 5 free movies every month. Learn more about becoming a giving member at givingcompany.com/giving membership and start watching great movies today. The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I'm your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
We're here in office, man.
We are face to face.
Face to face.
There's no masks. You don't see any masks. Well, I guess they're on the table, but we don't need them.
Wild boys over here on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
It is. I had a meeting today, Dan, in a conference room, 5 people.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, you talk about a new day.
Yeah.
So
almost back to normal.
We have a very special guest in the studio today, Dan, who's actually done a little time in Alpharetta, Georgia. How about that?
Oh, nice.
Janine Maxwell, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
It's great to have you, and it's great to have you in person.
It is good to be in person, let me tell you.
We're going to talk about kind of why you're here in a second, but if you don't mind, I'm going to run through your bio so that our listeners can hear all about the Janine Maxwell path to this very conversation, and we will take it from there. Dan, this is our second Canadian guest.
Welcome.
There is hope for Canada. Like if our listeners have written off Canada, we need to tell them Danielle Strickland, Janine Maxwell.
Yeah, Canada's cool in my book. I want to go visit.
We had all the winter sports with Danielle. That was one of our key
and
key
I
topics
moved away
of conversation.
because of winter.
Yeah. Well, here we go. Born in Northern Ontario, Canada, Janine Maxwell graduated from Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri. At age 24, Janine founded Onyx Marketing Group in Toronto and grew it over a 16-year period to become one of Canada's largest marketing firms with a blue-chip client list including Campbell Soup, Kellogg, Gillette, Kraft Foods, and Buena Vista Home Video. In 2006, she left it all behind to serve Africa's children orphaned by starvation, poverty, abuse, and the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Janine and her husband Ian are co-founders of a 501c3 organization called Heart for Africa, and they live on a 2,500-acre piece of land called Project Canaan in the tiny kingdom of Eswatini, Africa, formerly known as Swaziland. We got to talk about that. The Maxwells are parents to over 300 orphaned or abandoned children while employing over 300 Swazi workers who grow vegetables, run a dairy and egg-laying barn, vocational training centers, medical clinic, and schools. They also feed over 3,500 orphaned and vulnerable children every week through 30 churches and schools whom they partner with in the most remote parts of the country. Janine's personal and professional journey to present-day Eswatini reads like an adventure novel. It began on none other than September 11th, 2001, in New York City as Janine was evacuated from her hotel and told to run for her life as planes were being flown into the World Trade Center. Her husband, Ian, was on an American Airlines flight to Chicago, and their young children were across the border in Canada. That world-changing event was the catalyst that sent Janine into a deep depression and into the darkest parts of Africa in search for life's meaning. Janine felt God wanted her to close Onyx and follow him. What happened next was a roller coaster ride from the boardroom to the streets of Africa. Janine is a sought-after speaker and travels extensively to speak the truth about orphans in Africa. She has the unique ability to invite others to experience Africa through her eyes. Her new book, Hope Lives Here, gives a detailed explanation of what it's like to live in Africa, serve the people of Africa, and find hope in a hopeless place. She's also the author of It's Not Okay With Me and Is It Okay With You? Janine and Ian live on Project Canaan, Eswatini. They have 2 biological children, Spencer and Chloe. Janine, so great to have you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm exhausted.
That is awesome. Well, You're in the States right now, not in Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, because I think there was a big event in the Maxwell family. So give us the scoop.
The firstborn of all of these children got married last Saturday.
How about that?
Our son Spencer, who's 27, married Jane, who he met in Swaziland on a trip, on a missions trip.
Yeah.
And they're married, and we're happy to be able to get here because we just weren't sure whether we'd make it.
Yeah, right. How was the ceremony? How did everything go?
It was just beautiful. Yeah. On the lake, Lake Michigan, the sunset for hours. It was just gorgeous.
Wow.
Glad
That's
to be
awesome.
here.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Spencer.
One down and 300 more to go.
So, Dan, we had Terry Johnson from World Vision on the podcast, and he called me on Friday. His daughter was getting married Saturday, so he was having to pick up one of the bridesmaids whose plane landed late to get her to the bridesmaids' luncheon. Anyway, this is what he said to me. He goes, David, you know how we've had lots of conversations about the cost of putting your kids through college and that phase of life. He goes, that's nothing. He goes, that's nothing compared to Meredith's wedding.
Yeah, we're being the mother of the groom, though.
Yeah,
that's
right.
awesome.
That's right.
We just had to show up. I had to look good and, and throw a dinner party. It was great.
Nice. That's fantastic. Wow. Well, one of the things, Janine, that we learn, I think, early on in the book, and that if people follow you or research you or know about you, is that you were adopted. And tell us, I don't want to draw a conclusion. We need to hear from you, but I got to think that's woven into this story somehow. Tell us about how that impacted you and, from when you were little to even now. How does it shape your worldview and impact you?
Well, I was adopted when I was a baby, and I don't ever remember being told I was adopted, but I always knew I was adopted. And I had, in my mind, and a lot of adopted children have a ghost story. They've created this story in their mind, and a lot of parents don't know that until many years later. But I always knew I was chosen. That was the language used over me. But I had in my mind that my parents went into a grocery store. I could picture it very vividly. And between the celery and the lettuce, it was the refrigerated section. And there are all these babies lined up, and of course I was the cutest one, so they chose me. And I always felt that way.
Yeah.
And they always told me I was chosen. So and my mother is a believer. And so she would tell me that God placed me in their family. So early on, that was part of my DNA. And I thought that was pretty cool. And then, I was a believer, and then I started my business, and I was a believer in my business, and then my family, and then, God came third. And then 9/11 happened. And, a great way to right-side my top three.
Yeah.
But I remember being back at home after, it took me days to get back from New York City, and reading Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Light. And I think it was chapter 2, he talked about you are not an accident. And I'm thinking, well, whoever you are, Mr. Warren, you don't know my story, right?
Yeah.
Because I know that my mother's 15 years old. She got knocked up in the backseat of a car. And I was, in fact, an accident. So we can move on with your story, but I know that that's, I was an accident. Well, then, the next paragraph gives the scriptural backup of how I'm not an accident. And I read it and I heard it. It was truth to me. So I wasn't an accident. I learned that, I know only God can make a baby. And there was a plan for my life, even though I was conceived, not planned for. My mother was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, but God had a plan for my life. And at that moment, it sort of made me sit up and think, I better not screw this up. I better pay attention to what he wants me to do, because I was just in New York City and the towers were crashing.
Right.
What does he want me to do? So it was a big deal that not being an accident.
How about that? That's great. Now, Onyx Marketing Group, that was a successful venture for you and Ian. I mean, did you swallow hard as you sort of transitioned out of that? What was the term you used? I was a capitalist
Pig.
Wow.
Wow.
I say, Dan, that I was an unapologetic capitalist, and Janine uses different terms, so I might have to change my shtick a little bit.
Well, it's just how far you want to repent, really. But for me, it was I had I'm sitting here in America. I had the American dream, and I was Canadian. I had the nice house, the nice car. Success was important to me. We had influence, we had money, we had friends. But then after I went to Africa the first time, and met these children living on the street and met these girls who, are teenagers having babies, putting them in plastic bags and dumping them in the river because they don't know what to do with them, I went back home and my life had changed. And so for me, I didn't know what I was supposed to do in Africa. I didn't even know that it was Africa. I thought it was. What I knew it wasn't was the nice house, the nice car, and the fancy clothes.
Yeah.
And then it was a matter of, okay, if it isn't that, then what? So for me, the pill wasn't hard. It was hard going into the president of Campbell Soup and the president of Buena Vista Home Video and saying, I'm closing my business.
Yeah.
And now I would like to introduce you to my biggest competitor who I won over them.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So there were some pills there.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure my clients were well set up as well because I had to go. I had to go and help.
Wow. That's awesome. I guess we should divulge to our listeners, Dan, that we're actually the publisher of your third book, Hope Lives Here, which has just been a tremendous honor and privilege for us to be partnered with you and Ian and Heart for Africa and Project Canaan on this story. But it's your third book.
It is.
It's Not Okay With Me and Is It Okay With You? Those were your first two.
Yes.
Can you maybe put the three of those on a shelf and tell our listeners what would they experience if they kind of went through all three?
Sure. So the first one, Is Not Okay With Me, was really my journey to Africa. So I start off, the beginning of the book, like every good thriller, starts off on 9/11 when I hear gunshots and I'm running down the street. So we start, it's an action adventure book that ends up in the armpit of the world. And so it takes the reader through that journey of being in New York City, going through that thing that we just talked about, that I'm not an accident. So what am I going to do with my life? And I knew that my birth mother really struggled because she was kicked out of her home because it was 1963. It was an embarrassment. And the pain that she went through, the pain that the family went through, who I didn't even know them, I just knew the story. And so much happened so that I could be here. So what am I supposed to do with this? What plan does God have? So then I take you on a journey through Africa, share stories about what I saw, tried to liken them to, someone dying of AIDS in a mud hut, and my father was dying in a hospital in Canada. And the differences between the two, from the mud to the hospital bed to the oxygen in Canada and no oxygen, no medicine in Swaziland. And then that's really, what am I going to do with my life? I have to do something. I have to step out of the corporate world. And I felt, it's not okay with me, so I have to do something.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well, the second book, Is It Okay With You, continues that journey to Africa. But it was more a challenge to other people. Like, you're reading these stories, and I'd have people say, oh, your first book changed my life. I loved reading it. I bought 10 copies. I gave it. I have a man who bought 5,000 copies of my first book and handed them out at a conference in Vegas.
Wow.
And it was funny. I'm walking through the gambling tables and seeing my book beside all the chips. I'm like, whoa, that's kind of weird.
Go. Yeah, nice.
Odd. But and so, it seemed to have really touched people where they were. And perhaps because everybody knows where they were on September 11th. But this was more, okay, so if you say it's not okay with you, then what are you going to do about it? And it was more of a challenging book. Like, is it okay with you? And if it isn't, then what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
Because you can't say it's not okay and then not do something. I mean, we can, but we shouldn't, certainly as believers. And then the end of the second book, second last chapter, we find this piece of land in Swaziland, Africa. And it's title deed land, which means we can actually buy it. It's 2008, just before the crash.
Wow.
And the land, which is virgin land, no roads, no water, no electricity, no nothing. And it's $1 million.
Wow.
And we meet a guy in Alpharetta, because God does that, and and it's all his money. And 2 days after the crash, he wrote a personal check for $1 million for us to buy a piece of land in Africa.
Wow.
Impossible.
What, did that message come to him independent of you, or after he met you? How did that go down?
Well, we some of his people were on a trip with us. We came back. We'd spend 8 weeks every year in Africa, and we drag our kids along. And then we got back, and they invited us into this boardroom, sat us down. They said, this man is very philanthropic, and he would like to help, we think, and here's how we should approach him. Well, he walked into the room. The story's a little bit longer, but he sat down himself. No one was expecting him. And he starts sharing his vision. And he says, I have this vision for this piece of land. where there's children, there's orphans living there, and there's farm, and we're growing food, and there's dairy. And he describes this vision that my husband has, which I personally thought was insane because we know nothing about land development. And my husband's never seen a cow and he doesn't eat vegetables. But he seemed to think that this was a really great idea. And we hadn't told a soul about this.
Oh, my gosh.
And so he shares his vision that he believes God has given him. I start to cry. My husband does the timeout sign and says, I think we need to tell you something. And then he shares about this piece of land that we found in this country that no one's ever heard of. And this man says, well, how much is it? And Ian says, well, it's about $1 million, not including the cows and the goats that live on the land. Yeah. And there's a moment of pause. And he goes, well, $1 million isn't a lot, really.
Wow.
And we're thinking, well, we're $1 million short of $1 million,
right.
but to each their own. And then we left, and then the market crashed. And then 2 days later, I get an email on my BlackBerry back then saying that this man would like to donate the money and, please proceed with, finding this land, which, how do you buy land in Africa and all of those things.
Right.
But we had the money. So we proceeded and bought this 2,500 hectare or acre piece of land in Africa.
Wow. And that's the end of Is It Okay With You?
That's right. That was right at the very end. And so we have this land. And then so then I started writing a blog every week for the last 10 years. It was called Live from Swaziland. It's Saturday morning. Always the marketer.
There you go.
And people would say, you need to write another book. You need to write another book. And I'm like, I don't want to write another book. It's a lot of work. And you read my blog or print it all out, put it together. It's free, and then you could read as a book if you want.
Yeah.
But then
Staple.
COVID.
Use a stapler.
Use a stapler. Paper clips work, whatever you're more comfortable with. But then COVID hit. And it was our borders closed for 8 months. We couldn't go into South Africa. We couldn't leave. We live in Africa now, which I may have jumped ahead on that. But we lived there, and it was like, you got nothing else to do other than raise, 250 children and a whole farm. But it also seemed like the right time to try to put it into a place where people, if someone is trying to start an orphanage in another country, if they are trying to become self-sustainable, if they're trying to start an egg-laying barn, like it's not a how-to manual, but you can pull some of those pieces out if you have friends in ministry who, and everyone probably listening to this podcast, have someone who has a friend in another country and they're struggling with blah. You can go to that chapter. You don't even have to read the whole book. If it's poverty, look up poverty. If it's orphans, look up orphans. And that's what this book does, is it tells the journey from the end of number 2 through the how-tos, how-not-tos, the highs and lows, lots of lows, but lots of highs.
Yeah.
And for those of you who really don't want to go through reading the first 2, because I've just given you the highlights of them, there is an introduction at the beginning of the third book, Hope Lives Here, that will summarize everything I just said and brings you straight into the story.
Yeah. It's good. So let's talk about Eswatini. And I'm not sure if there's significance in the name change. You might want to enlighten us there. But here are some of the things that I think came out of the book. The poverty level, the percentage of HIV, the percentage of TB, half the kids don't even have a birth certificate. Anyway, we got to ask the expert, which is you.
Yeah.
Give us the view of Eswatini, like what's going on in that country.
So Swaziland used to be called Swaziland. It's a little tiny country within the borders of South Africa, and part of it borders on Mozambique. So when you look at a map of South Africa, there's 2 little round dots within the country. One of them is Lesotho. The one closer to the ocean is Swaziland. King Mswati III is the last absolute monarch on the continent of Africa. So in Swaziland, we have one tribe, one language, and he is king. So he is the absolute authority, and he is king above the prime minister and deputy prime minister and parliament, much of which he appoints.
Gotcha.
And so the country has been in turmoil for quite some time. We have about 1 million people. And when I first heard about Swaziland, it was back in 2005 when I was on this journey. And they had the highest HIV rate at that time. We still have the highest HIV rate. And HIV and TB are best friends, so they go hand in hand. Where you find HIV, you find TB. So when COVID came along, everybody just sort of held their breath thinking, well, this is the end of the country. But pre-COVID, we had a 70% unemployment rate. we've been through a drought, and even before the drought, every 70% of the nation grew their own food, which would be maize, which is the staple.
Yeah.
More than half of the total population are orphans and vulnerable children. And we have an acronym, not that you'd ever use it here, but OVC. Everyone in Africa knows what an OVC is, and it's orphan and vulnerable children, which is really tragic that we've had to shorten that up. I prefer to say an orphan and a vulnerable child, just so we're all focused on what it's really about.
But it's more than half.
More than half the total population.
Wow.
We have more than 20,000 households in the country of 1 million people that are orphan-headed households. So a child under the age of 18 is the oldest person in that household.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Children who aren't able to go to school because they might not have school fees. They may not be able to pay for uniforms. And a lot of them only eat 4 days a week because they get a meal at school. So on the weekends, there's no food at home. So it's really a very tragic situation right now. And then COVID hit, which just made things just that much worse.
Wow.
Heavy.
Yeah.
Tough environment for sure. As you were writing the book, I do want to fast forward because I'm sure our listeners are there. As I'm reading the words from the pages that you wrote in preparation for this podcast, you had said, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. You just mentioned borders closed for 8 months. How has COVID affected what's already a very vulnerable country?
Well, the government decided to lock down the borders, as I mentioned, and I know you had lockdowns here in the U.S. and all around the world, and everyone who's listening, every country, every county, every state, every province had different regulations and continue to have different regulations. In Swaziland, I think due to the fact that so much of the population are not educated, it's easier to put out an edict and keep the edict.
Yeah.
So the edict back in March 2020 was close the schools, everyone wear a mask, and for a couple months, we had to actually have a letter to drive into town to buy groceries. And those people who don't have a car or don't have access to a letter with a stamp on it, where do they go? So our feeding program as well, we decided we would ramp up feeding through our 30 churches, but it was illegal for anyone to gather. So the churches couldn't meet anymore. So the children couldn't go and get fed. And we were also stuck with, well, if we gather the children to feed them so they don't die of starvation and then they get COVID, and we weren't worried about the kids getting it back then, different story today. But we were very worried about the kids taking it back to their elderly grandmother, who's been the one caring for them because their parents died of AIDS, because we lost a whole generation. So, do we feed them? Is it better that they're starving or better that they don't take COVID to go or the grandmother? So we struggled with that. In addition, our hospitals haven't had medicine in a long, long, long time. Our government hospitals are very, very poor. And so, there might have been 4 ventilators in the country. Nobody had oxygen. There was very limited amount of oxygen. And so everybody stayed home and they were absolutely terrified. And with the high percentage of HIV that we had, everybody thought, well, everybody with HIV is going to get wiped out. It didn't really happen that way, which is interesting. And I think across Africa, medical professionals and scientists are still trying to figure that out. My husband's theory is that COVID is a mean enough virus and sneaky enough that it wants its own people. It doesn't want people with HIV. So I'm going to go there and say, they already have something. So I'm going to try to find new blood. So, he's not a scientist, so you wouldn't want to quote me on that. But
it's as reasonable an explanation as any, because we really still have no idea.
We don't know. Yeah. So wave 1 was really, really hard. Our prime minister died. Members of parliament died.
Oh, gosh.
And the country was hit at a very high level. And the king appoints the prime minister. And the king was in seclusion at the time and so didn't reappoint. So no one was really in charge, which was very difficult. And the borders were still closed. We couldn't leave the country. No one could come in. So 8 months goes by and we're still kind of the same. My husband and I, it's about an hour to a grocery store. So if we would drive together in the same car, we would stop by the police maybe 5 times. And if we both didn't have masks on, we would be fined, even though we lived together and there's just the 2 of us. So it was and is still a very great time of fear, uncertainty, and it is here too. But if you think about the kids, the students, so our school year goes January to December. So they stopped school beginning of March, so they'd only had a year. and they don't have electricity in their homes. Swazis live in houses made of mud and stick.
Yeah.
Their roofs are made of grass. They do not have laptops to do online learning. They don't have computers to do online learning. There is no electricity to plug it into, even if they did have that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the kids were just at home. And there's predators at home. And
That's right.
incest is a very big deal. There is a rape culture there. So a lot of teenage pregnancy. And schools didn't open again until end of January this year. So they lost a whole year of school. And then all of those kids were just moved forward to the next grade. So they lost a year, and now they're in the next grade up.
Yeah.
So they start back in school at the end of January, and for 2 or 3 weeks they're there. And then we're going through a time of civil unrest, which is a different topic, but they close the schools again. And so, we're looking at potentially 2 years of no school. And the impact, that's COVID related, but that's a generation. That's a generation of kids that have lost that window of real education to save their future.
Right.
So now we're in wave 3. People are, I have a friend who runs a hospital. They're the only hospital that is sort of the go-to hospital. And last Monday, they admitted 108 people into their ICU. And there's no blood in the country. So I get a message from her saying, do you have anybody who can go and donate blood? Because we don't have any blood. So it's just, and then we would hear, and I think I read about this in the book, that we kept hearing vaccines. So this was back in September 2020 when I was writing this, and just the uncertainty of it. And I like it in the book because it's a time marker to kind of say, this is what's happening in the U.S. You're discussing masks, and here's what's happening with us. Here's what's happening in South Africa. And, we kept hearing, until there's vaccinations, the world won't be safe. And I'm sitting there thinking, we can't get chickenpox vaccines in Swaziland.
Yeah.
We can't get MMR vaccines for our kids. Good Lord, when are we ever going to get, when is that going to happen? Now, I can say sitting, having this conversation at the end of August in 2021, we did get some vaccinations in the last couple of weeks. So that is good news.
That's good. Yes.
But we still don't have chickenpox or MMR, but we have COVID vaccines. So that's promising.
Wow. Well, it was fascinating to read the words as you're writing them about, hey, this thing called COVID, I guess, is around the world, and we don't really know what's going to happen. Yeah. And then by the time the book gets published, a few vaccines are showing up. We still don't know what's going to happen. You still don't know what's going to happen. I want to paint for our listeners, Janine, if you don't mind, because we're going to dive into some stories. You buy the land in 2009, is that right? Y'all moved there physically in 2012?
Yes.
I want you to give our listeners a picture of what this thing is today, because it is a scope and a scale that is much bigger than I was ever expecting to read about when I picked up the book.
And impossible. So in 2029, we buy this land, as I mentioned, my husband's brilliant idea, and it turned into a brilliant idea, which could only have come from God. So, there's nothing on the land. So we have to start with infrastructure. We need to put in roads. We need to, there's no river on the property, so we can't dam up a river. We have to dam up the streams that are coming down off from rainfall, really. We need to put in electricity. We need to start building buildings.
And building roads, just tell everybody, you have to clear brush, right?
Well, it's African bush, and the whole thing's on a mountain.
Yeah.
So if you want to build a building, you have to actually dig into the mountain to make something level, to make a flat spot to put a building. So,
it's like ball ground, Dan, or something like that.
Oh, yeah. We built a soccer pitch recently, and if anybody wants to help us finish it, because we have half the soccer pitch done, because we've had to dig back, and the wall that it's probably 30 feet high, and we just keep digging it and then moving it to the other side of the field and building up that side. Yeah. So that's how we're building the soccer pitch. But we had to put in the infrastructure. And I come from a marketing background. My husband has an economics degree, but he worked at the marketing company. We have no land development skills. Yeah. We had a little garden in our backyard, but now we have 5,000 chickens. And 5,000 laying hens lay an egg every 26 hours. And you can't turn them off. You can't go, okay, stop, good enough, hold. Every 26 hours, there's an egg coming out of that bird.
Oh, my gosh.
But those eggs, in support through the International Egg Commission, which you probably didn't know there was such a thing.
Did not know there was an IEC.
IEC, and the Egg Farmers of Canada really came alongside in a big way. And because of that, because we have 5,000 eggs basically every day, we can then hard boil them and take them out to help feed those children. So they're getting that perfect protein every day. So everything we do, we try to be very, very intentional about. And we could be doing any kind of protein, but the egg is the perfect protein. So we have an egg barn. We have our own dairy. We produce all of our own milk. We have, aquaponics, which is growing fish. We have hydroponics. We've built 65 buildings. We have our own schools, and we can talk about each of those as we go along. But it's a lot, and it's in 12 years. And every person who's ever worked in a developing nation or in Africa, they come and they say it's impossible. And it is impossible if it hadn't been for the hand of God.
Yeah. So 65 buildings, you have over 300 employees. You're serving how many kids now?
Well, in the introduction, you said 3,500, but because of COVID, we're now serve 4,500 kids every week in the most rural communities through these 30 church partners that have no other access to food. So it's gone up a full 1,000 in the last year.
Wow. And one of the things I want our listeners to understand that I read about is you started with kids, for the most part, less than 24 months of age, and you're aging your kids forward and adding more babies as you go. So the numbers are going to get bigger.
Yeah.
What grade are we at kind of right now?
Our oldest are 10 years old. We have 10-year-old twins. We actually have 14 sets of twins and 14 sets of biological siblings. But the oldest are in 4th grade.
Wow.
And every year we build a class.
And you're going to see them through school to vocational placement is the idea.
Well, our biological children, Spencer and Chloe, are 25 and 27. So those of you who have had children up to that age, you do see that their brain does fully develop by the time they're about 23, 24. And once we saw that...
Boys always later.
A little bit later.
Boys are always a little later.
So, we heard this when we were raising our first two, but then when we experienced it, we're like, oh, gosh, we better not send these kids out at 18 because we saw the difference between a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old. So our commitment really is to get them through high school. A lot of the kids won't make it through high school. They're developmentally delayed or were so malnourished when they came in. We have a 2.5-year-old. We broke a rule for someone, but we thought she was younger. And she weighed 11 pounds.
Wow.
She's just a tiny, tiny little thing. So she probably won't catch up, but you never know. And then, so 18, and then whether it's, learning a trade on our farm, which they would have started earlier than that, whether it's going to university, but getting them and their social skills and their ability to interact so that when they're 21 and they get to that stage that they really can, we want them to thrive. We don't want them, and that's a problem with children's homes all over the world and orphanages, that aging out. We see it in the foster care system. What happens when they're 18 and they're on their own? Mm-hmm. But 18, you really aren't ready. Yeah. You really that's when you need that strong support system to help you make decisions that you wouldn't have either thought about.
Yeah. Wow.
It's a long game.
Yeah. Here's one of the most amazing things that I had to wrap my head around. You and Ian basically become the parents.
Yes.
For the babies that show up on the farm. So your family, Spencer and Chloe, are biological. The rest of your family is how big?
Well, we're just over 300 children right now.
Tell our listeners about that decision.
Well, we knew that, my heart from the time I went to Africa and saw these children living on the street and they had nowhere to go. And, a 4-year-old who's been living there for 2 years. And I just met dozens and dozens of kids. And then I went to several orphanages and met the kids there. And they needed a parent role model. One of the homes that we visited a lot and I've learned a lot from, they had a mom and dad. And they might have had 2,000 kids there, but there was a mom and dad. And then other homes just have aunties and uncles. Mm. So, we did I did a lot of research before we started our home for abandoned babies, which is really what we called it, because we accept, and 50% of our children come in under 30 days. They're found in pit latrines, they're found in the side of the river, they're found in plastic bags.
Right after birth.
Right after birth. So they're brand new, which is great, though, because we're catching them early before they've been sexually abused and beaten and that kind of thing, although we've had some of those as well. But what I learned from children who grew up in orphanages, their advice to me was, you guys need to be mom and dad, because there needs to be a mom and dad. And our children, these 300 children, I can say, aren't orphans. So even though we talk in our ministry about hunger, orphans, poverty, and education, they are no longer orphans because they are our children. And that's part of their testimony. Just as I, as an adopted child, became my mother and father, became my mother and father when they adopted me, there is no adoption in the country, but it doesn't mean that I can't be their mother and Ian be their father.
Yeah.
So we're mom and dad, and then the staff are aunties and uncles, which is very normal in African culture. In fact, if your mother has sisters, you still call them mum. They don't have the word for aunt and uncle. So it's not an unusual thing, which works in our favor, to have lots of aunts and uncles around. So we're mom and dad, and we're ultimately we carry that weight, and we have that joy, and they know that they're in a big family.
On the more humorous side of this, because this is obviously a very serious topic, but I loved the part where you all had to have the talk.
Oh yeah, yeah.
the
my
talk.
gosh.
So that was fantastic. I think
Yeah.
you leaned on some people to help out.
Got some help with
the
that.
talk.
Yeah. And we have these books that will help us have the talk earlier, starting with God created me. So yes.
That's good. That's part of being a parent, right? It's part of being mom and dad.
And you know what happened was we have lots of kids who are HIV positive, and there are certain criteria when you're with Baylor Pediatric AIDS Clinic at what ages they need to hear what's going on. And so we had this, I'll tell the short version of this, but we were told that by the age of 8, our kids need to know that they are HIV positive and why they take medication. You don't have to go into a lot of details.
Yeah.
But in the process of our 2 kids being told this, they asked the nurse who was delivering the information, well, how did I get it? And she said, your mother gave it to you. And they both looked at me like,
That's you.
What? That's me. Why would you give me HIV? And I'm like, oh, okay. We have to have another conversation now to explain that I, in fact, didn't give you HIV. But now there's another player involved. So,
Wow.
Awkward moments.
Yeah.
As these building blocks come together, you've had a passion for Africa, it seems like, for a long time. 9/11 puts something on your heart that life has to be more about making money and being a capitalist pig. You and Ian get 2,500 acres of undeveloped, let's call it land. It's now a big farm with 65 buildings and all these different ventures and all these different employees and children. One of the things that you all have done, and I think our friends at Crisis Aid International do this as well in East Africa, is they combine a donation-based model with a capitalist, a commercial model, if you will. I think you have artisans that are selling art items, if you will. I think you have carpenters. You've got farmers and chickens and milk and
chickens,
all those things. Talk about how you weave those together and why that's so important for Project Canaan.
A lot of people who are in the non-governmental sector or in the charity world or in ministry, foreign ministry, there's a lot of talk about self-sustainability. And when we first started looking into that, we were looking for, let's go and find all the people who are doing that, and we'll just follow what they're doing because we don't need to reinvent the wheel, certainly since we have absolutely no skill or background in this. But we are business people. And so we could understand the business model of it. And because we were business people and know what it takes to make a buck, I also didn't like having my hand out asking people to make donations. And yes, there's some pride in there, but also if I would rather sell you something than ask you to make a donation. So, I mean, even the book, all the profits that we generate from the book will go to help fund a library. It's not coming back to us personally.
Right.
But trying to get our heads around what can we generate income from? So our Kutsala artisans, we make 5,000 Christmas ornaments a year, and they're beautiful. And we have a whole website and a warehouse in Alpharetta, Georgia, that supports that. And it employs, we had 110 people as artisans up until COVID, and now we're down to 30. So we still have 80 people who aren't employed.
Yeah.
And have had nothing. We try to provide food packs and things, but still, it's been a long, long time. So there's selling things, but then there's also how do you reduce the need for donor funding?
Yeah.
So if we were buying milk at the local store, we would probably feed a lot less of it to our children. But because we started a dairy, we can not only provide it at we still, there's a small cost involved that we need to obviously pay for.
Right.
But we can feed our children lots of milk, and we make our own yogurt, and we can make ice cream, and we can make butter, and so all of those things that we would have to raise funds for.
Yeah.
We reduce those costs significantly. So the way we look at the farm is we want everything to either generate income or reduce the cost that we need.
Okay.
So even our
Gotcha.
mechanic shop, we have a mechanic shop.
Okay.
Rather than going to town and having a really lousy job done from, we call them bush mechanics, and your tire flying off your car, we've trained people so they have a skill and technique to be able to do it on the farm. So we still have to pay them, but it's a lot cheaper than it would be if we went to town.
Yeah.
And it's a venue for our kids as they get older. There are going to be kids who are going to be great mechanics, and that's the way they want to go. So we're getting that up and running so that our kids, even in the next year or two, the ones who are interested in tinkering can go down and learn how to change a tire and things like that. Just like, in the old days growing up on a farm.
Yeah.
Wow. So the big buzzword in society today, Dan, here in the U.S.?
COVID?
Identity.
That's what that is. One. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So you devote an entire chapter to identity. This must be really important for your kids on the farm. Can you talk about why this is such an area of intentionality for you?
Well, we have a lot of people who I think they're well-intended. You're never really sure about people's motives anymore. But a lot of people who, provide a lot of commentary on, when our kids get older and, when they age out, and basically they're just going to be another pool of kids that go out into society and aren't successful, and they're orphans. And I keep trying to explain that, first of all, we are their parents, so they're not orphans. So let's just take that label off, because they're not. Let's cross off that label. And so as you start removing labels, a healthy thing to do is to add labels. Chosen, God has placed them. Some of those words that I already talked about.
Yeah.
And that is your identity. That's creating your identity. And when you look back to your childhood, some of the things that you remember from your childhood might be because your mother kept a memory box, which we do for every single one of our children. Their favorite article of clothing that they wore to death will go into their memory box. That's really fun Valentine's card that they maybe made and gave to me, personally. Here, Maga, here's this card that I made to you, and I'll put it in there. So things, and even when we have a child come in, every single child, whatever clothes they have on when they arrived, even if I personally took the clothes to the hospital because the baby's been abandoned and there's no clothes, those clothes come back home, we wash them, we put them in their memory box. So when we sit down and have the conversation, here's where you started. And look at how cute you were. You were so little, you were only 4 pounds or whatever. But as I was writing that chapter, I was reading Charles Martin, one of my favorite authors. And he, in his book, was talking about, and he worded it so nicely. He said, you have to know whose you are before you know who you are. And that is the foundation of what we do. They need to know that they are a child of God.
Yeah.
And when a child does accept Jesus as their Savior, the language we use is you're in God's family. So we've tried to change some of the language a little bit that's, maybe considered Christianese. It works for some, it doesn't work for others. But now you're part of God's family because you've accepted him. And being part of God's family is a really big deal. And if a child runs up to me and they say, Maggie, which is mom, I just became, I joined God's family and I'm so excited. And I'll say, we get to spend eternity together.
Yeah.
Like we'll be together forever. And how cool is that?
Yeah.
But that's because now they know whose they are.
Yeah.
I get choked up talking about it.
That's good. That's good. Amazing. One of the other things that you mention a couple times in the book is this phrase, focus or fail. And of all the things that you have taken on at the farm, at Project Canaan, the artisans, the carpenters, the mechanics, the vegetables, the dairy, etc., I would venture to say, this is a guess, that you've had to say no to an equal amount or maybe even a greater amount of options. Talk about that phrase, focus or fail, and why that's such a big kind of guiding principle for you all.
I think that comes from our business background. When you're whatever, I'm an entrepreneur, so whatever business that I was focusing on, and it was marketing at the time, you can do a million things in marketing. And if you spread yourself too thin, you're not going to be successful. Most successful entrepreneurs know that, and certainly successful business people know that. And so for us, we had to really identify what do we want to do. And our acronym of HOPE is Hunger, Orphans, Poverty, and Education. But even under hunger, we would have well-intended people coming saying, well, if you're growing food here, you should be helping out in the community. You should be drilling boreholes, which is $25,000 a borehole if there's water.
Yeah.
And then those people can grow their own food. But I say, but the people living out there are children. This isn't just an issue of water. And we found ourselves always, myself probably more than Ian, being defensive about that and having to over-explain. And then we found that the better way to do it is say, rather than we can't do that, or we don't do that, or here's why we're not going to do that, we would flip it around and say, here's what we do.
Yeah.
We focus in these four areas, and here's what hunger means to us. Here, under our orphan program, under our poverty program, under education, here's what it means to us, and these are the parameters. So if you would like to participate in any of these, this is what we do, and you are welcome.
Wow, that's good.
If you want to drill boreholes or wells, there are lots of organizations out there who do really good work and they do it well. And I can give you a list of them if that's where your heart is. Because that's what some people think, that's where their heart is. Their heart is in whatever it is. You need to follow what God wants you to do. Yeah. But this is what we do.
That's good. That's good. One of the things that I want our listeners to realize is the depth and the diversity of stories that are in the book, Hope Lives Here. And you actually opened the book with a pretty tough story. It's almost like the movie Horse Whisperer. Dan, did you ever see that movie, Horse Whisperer? Where like the horse accident happens right at the beginning, and all of a sudden the audience is like, oh man, this is tough right out of the gate. That's kind of how the book is. There's a really tough story right at the beginning, which I appreciate that you kind of talk about the reality. I'm just asking a very personal question. You must have experienced the highest of highs and the lowest of lows as you are caring for these over 300 members of your family. How do you deal with the emotional roller coaster, sorry to use a secular term when describing it, of those experiences?
Well, I'll say that the last couple of months have been harder than the other months. And I think maybe it's because my son was getting married and just the reality of my biological child sort of clashing, or not clashing, but, he's so happy and he's successful and he's doing well. And then the flip side of it is these children who more and more frequently were getting these babies because these girls have been impregnated at 13, 14 years old. But I would say on a daily basis, and certainly people who are serving out in the mission field, I think having routine is very helpful. So Ian and I wake up every single morning, 7 days a week. One of us puts on the coffee and the other one goes and gets the coffee. Come back to bed, open up the curtains. We're looking at the farm and we open the Bible and we open our devotion. We have that routine. And I think that helps a lot because it's kind of like, okay, it's a new day.
Yeah.
It's a fresh cup of coffee. And we also know that just by getting up, we can make a difference. And I never felt that here. I never felt that when I was in Canada, that getting out of bed, I can make a difference. And I feel that there. Whether I get up and I just go down to the children's campus and just sit with some babies or get love on some toddlers. We have 42-year-olds right now. For anybody out there who has a 2-year-old.
You have 40.
Or
oh, my
2-year-old
gosh.
Grant. We have 40 of them. But I tell you, I get down there and I'm like this superhero. They with my blonde hair, they all come running and they're so excited to see me. So it's a great ego boost.
Yeah.
But then when my phone rings, it's inevitably someone from social welfare or the police or hospital saying, hey, I need your help. And those are, I know that's going to be a super hard conversation, but I know it's going to be ending with me being able to help someone. Even if it's they need food, we provide food through our partners with Feed My Starving Children. We provide food to the social welfare offices around the country because the government doesn't have any food. So even if they're calling to say, I have a family of 6 children sitting in front of me, they have nothing. Can you increase the donations that you give to us as government by another box of Manapack every month so that we can feed this family? Yes. Because I got out of bed and answered my phone.
Yeah.
And I have food sitting in the warehouse. I have children who are hungry. And if we start running low on food, I know I can go back to Feed My Starving Children and we can get more food. So it's again, I'm an entrepreneur and every day is a new day. And every day I get to save a life.
Yeah.
And if I don't actually save a life that day, I just have to go down and see the other 300 lives that we've already saved.
Yeah.
And hang out with them and hear their stories and what, the story of what happened at school that day, or who's doing what, or, who, the little, Isaiah, who showed everyone that he could fly, but in fact he couldn't fly, and so has a broken arm. So I need to go see Isaiah and okay, children, let's gather around. You can't fly, because you don't have wings. So let's do lesson number 47. So and those things, even that you could cry because Isaiah has a broken arm, but no, it's a broken wing, and you just go on. You just go on and know that Jesus is there with us.
Yeah. I love that story because there's certain examples, there's certain things that as you look around the world, you say, something binds us all together, right? I have confidence that there was a creator, that there is a creator, that there is a savior, because there are certain universal things that flow through all of us. Little boys thinking they can fly and breaking their arm, that tends to be one of those.
And I said to our staff, that's very unlikely to happen with any of our girls, but keep an eye on the boys. But the other side of that is that we see miracles every day.
Yeah.
And I have seen blind children. There's a boy that we have named Miracle. And he was found in a black plastic bag in a dumpster behind a restaurant. And he was a newborn, and they tied the top of the bag. And so by the time he was found and taken to the hospital, he was blue. They were able to resuscitate him. But by the time we got him and we assessed him and our pediatrician saw him, she said he's blind. Well, we pray over him. We pray continually for the children. And 6 or 7 months later, all of a sudden, he's responding to light, and there's nothing blind about him. There's nothing. He's been healed.
Wow.
A set of twins, Holly and Ivy, that we got right before Christmas, and we get to name some of them. So I thought that was awesome names. But they were deaf, and now they're not deaf. A little girl who we swore we were told would never walk. In fact, Andy and Sandra Stanley were with us, and we picked up little Grace, and they said she won't sit, she won't walk. And she runs to school every day.
Oh, my
Now, it's not a pretty run, but we're not driving her. And she's very independent, and don't touch me because I'm walking on my own.
Wow.
And it's a miracle. Absolutely a miracle.
Amazing. Sorry to put you on the spot, but as I was thinking through this and hearing some of your comments, and one of the things that you did in the book, Janine, was you were very gracious and intentional about highlighting some of those organizations that have helped you all along the way. And it's sort of been fun for us as your publisher, because we're headquartered here in Alpharetta, Georgia. It just so happens that a few of those organizations have, roots or relationships to Alpharetta, Georgia. Could you maybe talk, and I don't want this to turn south like we forget somebody and you and I are going to hear about this podcast and, in a couple of weeks.
I'm starting to sweat a little bit.
But there are some organizations, the company that provides the Manna Packs, the Rotary Club here in Alpharetta, Scapes. Can you maybe just talk about a few of those as you look back on the last 12 years of Project Canaan, your board, whoever it might be, like, this is what God's journey is all about, is that he sends people at the right time. You can tell I'm passionate about this, to walk alongside you and Ian and your family and the team to make things happen. Can you maybe give us a few of those highlights of the organizations or the people that have had a big impact on your journey?
Yeah. Well, Pete Wilkerson, who is one of the partners at Scapes Landscaping right here in Alpharetta, Georgia, has been absolutely instrumental from the very beginning. He personally, he's one of the owners of the company, and he travels on his own dime and takes 10 days off a week, 10 days off of work once or twice a year, and comes over and literally has walked through the snake-infested bush, and he's terrified of snakes. So he wears these big, knee-high snake boots, but he's helped us place every road. He's done the contour maps. He's done the land planning, and then, and it's bush. So once we, he comes and he plans, and we build buildings here, there, and everywhere. And then a year later, we'll say, okay, we're ready for you again, because we've moved the bush back, and he comes back and does that again. So he's been really, really instrumental in that. North Fulton Rotary, of course, have been, and John Bach and the people there.
So I have to be honest, I didn't know what a Rotary was until I read your book. So.
Rotary International is this huge organization.
Yeah,
my father, my grandfather.
Yeah.
And they do service projects all over the world, but water is one of the things that's really important to them. And so, as I mentioned, we don't have a river on the property. We've built 2 or 3 dams, and Rotary was very involved in the first large dam, a $300,000 project. But then we went into this drought, so even the dams were empty because we didn't have any rainfall. So they helped us kick off a project of bringing water from the top of the mountain, which is an $850,000 project.
Wow.
And an engineering feat, because we're specialized in that, Ian and I. No, we don't. But God sent the right people who do.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was an engineering firm who focuses on water living on the other side of our mountain. And the man is Israeli and came from Israel to work on water projects. And he was on the other side of the mountain where we're bringing the water from. Like, you can't make this up.
Yeah.
And then we built a 6-mile pipeline up and down over mountains so that now we're water secure. And that all started with North Fulton Rotary Club. North Point Community Church, not only have they visited and they've sent teams over, but we're part of their Be Rich program every year. So they've helped us with everything from a school bus to staff housing to our children's home. But a really interesting connection, because it's not just about money, and they send teams over to help us with our children's program. But they were also the ones that we spoke to when we're in the middle of the drought and we can't grow anything. We rolled up our drip tape on our farm. We have this huge, beautiful farm, and we can't grow lettuce. And we built a greenhouse to have hydroponics, and there wasn't enough water for hydroponics. And they said, well, have you heard of aquaponics? And we said, no. And they said, well, it uses 5% of the water to take a plant from seed to harvest. And you're growing fish at the same time, and you're not using soil.
Oh, my gosh.
So it was them who connected us with some people in Denver, and all of a sudden we are back in the farming business again, and there's no fresh seafood in the country. You can't buy fresh seafood in the country of Swaziland or Eswatini, except from Project Canaan, because we have fresh tilapia.
Unbelievable.
And our kids now eat fish that was harvested, and I grew up in Northern Ontario, so the first harvest of fish was Mother's Day last year, and we brought up 300 fish, and I showed them how to gut them and clean them and take the heads off, and they're like, oh, Maggie, that's so gross. I'm like, look, it's really delicious. It's worth it.
That's right.
So, it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a very big village. And Feed My Starving Children, provide us with probably 4 to 6 containers of food a year, and every container has 270,000 meals. Wow. We have to pay for the shipping, so we're always looking for people to help with that. It's about $10,000 to ship a container to us.
Okay.
But then we use that food not only for our own children, but mostly for distribution to our feeding partners. And we've saved thousands of lives because of that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What a great story. Well, I wanna turn our attention a little bit to maybe the capitalist pig in me and talk about this book and how people can get it. But before we go there, what do you want the reader to experience when they pick up Hope Lives Here?
I would like, I think a lot of the people who read this book are like me. I'm just a normal, ordinary person, and never, I was successful in business, but never ever thought that this is going to sound terrible. I didn't ever feel I'd be that valuable to God. And I knew I could do workplace ministry and I can raise my children in the faith. But, there's missionaries and then there's people like us, who, we can make money, we can give it back to God, because that's really what he needs. Not, I learned early on it's all God's money. It is all his money. And as soon as we start thinking it's our money, we're in real trouble. So I want ordinary, everyday people to read this book and go, wow. God can use ordinary, everyday people who really are broken and screw up and, might say a bad word from time to time. And he still uses us. And you just don't be afraid of saying yes. And don't be afraid of asking, because I think for a lot of, even in my adult life, I felt that God was kind of trying to trick me a little bit. It's that, what do you want me to do? And then he gives me a multiple choice. And if I get it wrong, I've screwed up. But he wants to give me the desires of my heart, because he wants that to be the desires of his heart. And when you ask for what he wants you to do and expect an answer, he'll actually answer.
Yeah.
And it's super cool. So I want them to read it. Don't be afraid of the hard chapters. Read them, because, a lot of people say to me, oh, I don't want to read about a baby being dumped in a pit latrine. And I said, well, the baby doesn't want to be dumped in a pit latrine. Like, you're just reading about it. I'm telling you about a child that is my child who landed in a pit latrine. Her mother dumped hot coals on her. Her uncle dumped the dirt on top of the hot coals to put the flames out. And now the child is burned, but she's a happy 6-year-old and she loves life. And the mother has repented and there's forgiveness. So don't feel sorry for yourself because you are reading a hard story. Think about the child.
Yeah.
And what can you do to help that child? Can you sponsor that child? Can you help education that child? And what can you do? Because we have a lot, we've been in the country now for 6 weeks, and it's amazing in a country that people are so blessed. I just hear a lot of complaints and how hard things are. And I don't want to, I can't burst their bubble by saying, well, let me tell you what hard is. Because, you don't make friends that way. but there's a lot of hard in the world. And I'm sorry. It's, you need to read the book and see what hard is. And then ask God, what do you want me to do about this? Whether it's through Heart for Africa, whether it's through a Rotary International, another charity, but get involved and do something.
That's good.
Do something.
Yeah, like it. So as of today, Hope Lives Here is available for pre-order on Amazon. It's also available somewhere else, I think.
On our website, you can go to heartforafrica.org, but kutsala.com. So it's Kutsala. Kutsala is the Siswati word that means hardworking. And that's our website, and that's where we sell our beadcraft, our woodworking, hand-blown glass, everything that's made in Swaziland that we've shipped here. And 100% of the profit goes back to help our children and provide for their education and things like that. So we do have some books that were pre-printed that you can buy it there, and then it'll be available on Amazon.com and Amazon.ca and other places around the world.
Yeah. Awesome. Now, heartforafrica.org?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Heart for Africa, not Heart of Africa, which some people think it is.
Heartforafrica.org. What about you? Can people follow you?
Yes, I'm on
Ian?
Facebook. I have Ian is on Facebook, but he doesn't do Facebook.
Okay.
So you might as well just follow me because I provide his content. Yeah. I have an author page on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. Great. You can follow Heart for Africa. There is a Project Canaan page, but it's more for Swazis. It's more local content. So if we're selling butternut squash, or we're selling beets, or we're selling lettuce, you'll be able to see what we have for sale in Africa that day.
That's good.
But we do post very regularly. If there's a new baby that's come in, we post it that same day. So you can, if you're interested in what we're doing, and birthdays, if we have a birthday that day, which we have a lot of birthdays, we post the birthday cake and the photo with the child with their birthday cake. So you can really get very involved through social media.
That's great. Final 2 questions. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to what might be coming down the mountain or down the pipe at Project Canaan? Anything new on the horizon that you and Ian and the team are thinking about?
Well, our children, as I mentioned, are in 4th grade. And so in 8 years from now, they will be graduating from high school. And again, for those of you who have had a high schooler, that 8 years goes very quickly. So we need to start building. We're in the process of building 5th grade. Then next year we build 6th, 7th, all the way through. So middle school and high school are the next big projects, and they're finished those classes in 2029. So we need to get the show on the road, as they say.
Gotcha.
We are implementing right now a solar power plant, which is really exciting. Another Be Rich support program from North Point.
Okay.
They help us set up a matching fund on that. So we should be able to provide probably 70% of all the solar power that we need during the day, which is a really big deal because all of our power comes from South Africa. And South Africa has not been able to keep up with their own demand, and they have brownouts every single day. So that will help us to become, again, more sustainable, more secure. And if they turn off the power one day, which they very well could do, we'll be able to continue on with, refrigerating food and having the dairy continue, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So those are big ones.
Good.
The last one that's really exciting for us is, and Rotary North Fulton comes into it as well, is our mechanic shop. We currently have a mechanic shop, and they're doing the best they can. We recently applied for a grant from North Fulton Rotary, and through matching grants and how Rotary works, we received a $155,000 grant to buy all the equipment to build really a state-of-the-art car mechanic shop. We don't have a building. And so when people ask us, how do you know what God wants you to do next? Well, you apply for a grant that's really impossible to get. We now have $155,000 of equipment that's ready to purchase, but we still need to build the building. So that's our next big fundraising initiatives to get that building the funds in, build it. So then we can create a whole training school for young men, young women as well. But that's an age group that really needs to be involved, learn, be encouraged, and find hope through employment.
Yeah, that's great. It's really good. That's like our our buddy King Randall, right? Down in Albany, Georgia, I think he is, who's helping young boys become mechanics.
Got his own
It's a
school,
big deal.
Yeah.
A really big deal.
So here's the big finishing question, Janine, and our listeners have heard me ask this many times of our Good Samaritans that Dan and I interview on this podcast. And listeners, forgive me, but we got to go back to Luke chapter 10 just to unpack this for a second. And there's a number of things that I obviously don't know what Jesus was thinking when he told the parable, but there's a couple things that always stand out about the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's a man who's left for dead, robbed, beaten, and he's left by the side of the road. And there's a bunch of people that walk on by. They don't turn their head, or maybe they turn their head and then they turn back and keep going. Jesus highlights a priest and a Levite, so some religious people who are no better than the non-religious people at walking by and ignoring somebody who's been left behind. The other thing that's intriguing to me about the parable is that the hero is a Samaritan. And at the time, Jews and Samaritans were at odds with one another, socially, racially, culturally, politically, religiously, all those things. So, I'm speaking to the people that think like maybe America is divided and a cesspool of division and argumentation, but no worse certainly than the Jews and the Samaritans, or the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland, or whatever it might be. You and Ian decide that you're not going to walk by these kids, more than half of which are orphan and vulnerable children in the country of Eswatini. Not everybody is going to be able to pack up their bougie lifestyle after running a capitalist marketing firm and have the DNA that you and Ian did to go do what you have done with the help of so many and the blessing of God in Swaziland. But there's got to be some non-negotiables that you and Ian have for Christians, for evangelicals, for believers, that is like, look, this parable was the cornerstone of who is my neighbor. After Jesus said the two most important commandments were to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he gets asked, who is my neighbor? And we get the parable of the Good Samaritan. Can you maybe give a call to action, like whip us into shape? Us largely privileged, spoiled, sorry to use the term, but you get where I'm going, Americans. And look, I'm the worst of the actors here, so I'm not calling out anybody. Whip us into shape.
Ooh, well, I mean, it starts with stop looking in the mirror. And that's sort of the opposite of what people say. Oh, I need to look in the mirror and start with that person. But stop looking in the mirror and start looking outside.
Yeah.
You have good neighbors. I think about North Fulton Charities and the poverty, the hidden poverty that's here. And if you're in this particular area, there are so many places that you can help, and there are so many people who need help. And are they as poor as the children in Africa? No, but it's different. They don't live in Africa. They live here.
Sure.
And if you don't have food to put on your children's table, then that is unacceptable. That is unacceptable in this great nation. I think that America, whether you are divided and the church is divided, I mean, good Lord.
Exactly.
The conversations I've had in the last few weeks are just, they make me sad.
Yeah.
Because you can agree to disagree on something, but don't stop serving. Don't stop helping. Ask God what you're supposed to do. And I've been in many, many functions the last few weeks with very wealthy people. And, they, as my father would say, well, they're wealthy because they don't give away their money. And that's okay if you're not a believer. But if you're a believer and you have more than you need to help. Yeah. You have to. You can't walk. If you were with me in Swaziland, and I've had lots of people come on trips where we get to go and pick up a baby.
Oh.
I mean, how would you not? How would you drive by that baby on the side of the road? You wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
I don't think there's any person listening to this who, if they were with me in Swaziland and they knew there was a place to take that child, that they wouldn't slam on the brakes or say, Janine, stop the car. there's a baby lying on the side of the road. Well, why does it have to be a baby on the side of the road in Africa when there's children all around you who need help? There's women, there's men, there's so many people who need help here.
Yeah.
And if you don't like the idea of helping your neighbor here, then help me. Help Ian and I help the children of Africa.
Yeah.
You know, you can sponsor a child. You can donate to help build a school. I mean, what would it be like to help building a school for the future generation of a country? You know, there's 300 children here with us now, but there will be 600 by the time our first graduating class happens.
That's amazing.
There will be thousands of children who will change the future of this nation.
Yeah.
So be a part of changing a country. But do something. It doesn't have to be Africa. Do something. Just stop looking in the mirror.
That's good.
And stop complaining.
Yeah. I like that.
It just gets old. And believe me, your relatives and your neighbors and your friends are also tired of it.
That's good.
There you have it.
You remember her fellow Canadian, Danielle Strickland, what she said? Get out of your heads and go serve somebody.
Yeah. It's true.
She's like, you
stop.
Americans.
Just stop. I mean, it just gets old. It's stop it. Stop it. And we say to our kids, stop that. Or the other thing we'll say to our kids is, we don't do that. We don't do that.
Yeah. I love it. Well, Janine, this has been a delight. I want to thank you so much for spending time with Dan and I this afternoon. Thanks to you and Ian and Spencer and Chloe and all your other kids and your teammates and your employees for all the great work that they're doing. As we started, it has been a privilege for iDisciple Publishing to walk alongside you with this third book that's kind of detailing your journey, and we hope you have enjoyed your time in the U.S. and
awesome.
Maybe we'll see you in Eswatini sometime in the near future.
That would be awesome.
See the farm, and we'll take some peeps over there, Dan, and
let's go.
Check it out.
Meet some kids.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're really
That's
cute. And they
awesome.
all look like me.
But it's been a delight. Thank you so much for joining us. Janine Maxwell, everybody.
All right,
Thank you.
guys. Thank you for joining us on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I'm your host, Dan Veros, and my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
and our very special guest.
Thank you, Janine Maxwell.
Yeah.
You guys have a good
We'll
one.
talk to you next time. Thanks, everybody.
For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.